China.
I went to China as a European, and honestly, it completely changed my perspective on their country. Before I start this video, though, I want to just point out I am not an expert in geopolitics or in economics or whatever. All of the information from this video is purely things that I have experienced myself from going to China, meeting people, and speaking to businessmen. So I was in China for 3 weeks, and it was to accompany my dad to go to the Remax World Expo in Zhuhai. So for context, my dad owns his own company here in South Africa called Delays, like after our family name. But he used to work for this other company called Static Control. And it was through this company that he was able to gain many different contacts throughout the world by working as the general director for the company for Africa, Middle East, and India. And from what I know is that he was able to um, push for the company's sales through all of these different like less developed areas of the world simply because the Americans were essentially incapable of going there themselves. Although he already did have a lot of contact throughout the world, but that's a story for another time. And so because of his time in Static Control, it was thanks to that he was able to gain this reputation as a hardworking Westerner, but also with a lot of friends, a lot of experience in the industry, and that's how he was invited to come to the Remax World Expo. Even though he was working in places like Congo or Nigeria in some messed up conditions in rebel controlled territories. So like I said, this only made him an obvious invitee to the expo. And it was decided that I should come with him as well, since I was also in South Africa. And turns out we were invited to not just one, but two expos. So the first one was the Remax World Expo for like 4 days. Then for a week, we would have a time off to just explore the city, potentially check out Hong Kong and Macau, which we couldn't do. And then the second expo was actually the GBA Human Expo on robotics and AI. And thankfully for both events, we were actually given VIP access thanks to our dear friends at RT. Not that RT, Recycling Times, not Russia. So what actually happened? Turns out at both expos and even during the break in between, I was thankfully privy to some very, very interesting conversations with some very rich and very smart people in China, from local industrial barons and even some state-owned defense enterprises. And so obviously, having never been to East Asia, as my life has mostly been centered around Europe and Africa, this was a completely different experience for me, and it definitely changed a lot of my worldview. So my first observation when I was in China, and which is one that a lot of Westerners make when they go there, is just the sheer cleanliness and order. Coming from Europe and Belgium, that is not something we have. And for anyone who knows me in real life, they know that that is something I criticize quite regularly about life in Belgium or even in Europe in general. And now, obviously, the contrast was made even more evident having come from South Africa to China instead of just Belgium to China. But obviously, an argument a lot of Westerners like to make, even if they've never been to China, is well, is because China is kind of like North Korea. They over police their people. There's a social credit system. First of all, there's no such thing as a social credit system. Frankly, I don't really know where Western media has gotten this idea from, but for as long as I was there, I even asked people, there is no such thing. Maybe it was only rolled out in specific cities. Maybe it's just pure propaganda. But as far as I know, the social credit system does not exist, at least not in Zhuhai. Back to the policing question. The funny thing is, Chinese police, I'm not gonna lie, I don't take them really seriously. They drive around in these like little absurd vans that don't even have like doors, And oftentimes their policemen just don't look intimidating at all. And which is really crazy if you come from Belgium, where the average policeman in Brussels or in Flanders, or even in the Netherlands sometimes, they is just like the Cassius Thundercock meme. This like 2 meters tall, mega racist body cam's been turned off since the colonial era. Matter of fact, their body cam is still a raw material back in Congo. It just doesn't even exist yet. Meanwhile, in China, they don't even have guns on them, at least not that I saw. I've only seen this one instance where the police actually looked intimidating, except it was these two military guys, right? Okay, big, strong, in a tiny little car, just patrolling the seaside because they didn't want people from Macau or from China trying to swim from one end or to the other. And so, one of the reasons I learned why Chinese cities are so orderly and clean and generally have a lot of better etiquette than a lot of European cities is that Chinese cities, well, the Chinese government actually organizes their cities according to tiers depending on their population and urban sprawl, and then has them compete with the other cities in their tier. So, for example, how this would be applied to Europe is imagine if you got Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Madrid all competing for things like politeness, driving etiquette, cleanliness, like street cleanliness, quality of services. I don't know, but you get my point. Generally speaking, I think if the EU could organize that in Europe, now don't get it confused. I'm not the biggest fan of the EU, but if it's a successful policy with possibilities to turn Brussels into less of a trash filled dump, that would honestly be great coming from a resident of Brussels. And I think the biggest benefit from this policy will probably be getting annoying Karen American tourists to stop whining about scammers and the trash in our streets. So another thing that was crazy about China is just the sheer space they have to build. And so obviously coming from Europe, our cities are like thousands of years old, full of culture, generally beautiful. But the thing is, in China, a lot of the cities are new. And so instead of building their roads for like horse carriages, like they were like Europe did 1,000 years ago for the Middle Ages, Chinese cities, their newer cities like Zhuhai, are just massive. It feels like incredibly liberating. Again, I love Europe, but there's something almost reinvigorating about being in a city where you can just like see the sky instead of feeling like the city is trying to like clamp down on you. And even then, it's not even to say that China has a lack of history. Matter of fact, in Zhuhai, they have a massive temple outside of the city. It's somewhere in the mountains, but it's still considered Zhuhai. Just amazing, beautiful, so colorful, magnificent, and it's so far up. You can see the city in this distance, but you can especially see like beautiful forests, nature, hills, lakes all around it, and it's guarded by Shaolin monks. Which then brings me to my next point, which hopefully will make me sound like less of a CCP shill, which is I actually have a criticism, although it's less so founded on the way the Chinese seem to handle their faith. Now, again, I wasn't in China for a very long time, and this wasn't particularly a subject that I approach with a lot of people there, but it seemed as if the Chinese, I'll give my reasoning for this in a bit, but it would seem that the Chinese have a different approach to faith and religion and that approach is seemingly, okay, I don't claim myself to be an expert on religious studies in China, but from what I've seen is that the Chinese have a very materialistic approach of their religion. And I don't mean materialistic in the sense of money, 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 money. What I mean by materialism, which isn't in the purely money sense that pop culture has given to us. I mean materialism in the sense where what they ask of their gods isn't anything about the kind of sinful guilt that like the Abrahamic religions have, but rather they just go to a temple or a shrine, they pray for wealth, health, happiness, and education for their children, and then they just leave, which had me kind of weirded out as a Christian, since oftentimes if I go to church, I don't ask for God to give me things, I just ask for mercy. And so that's a very big contrast I noticed. Now, I have my own reasoning as to why that is. The way I would interpret it is that communism, because of its materialism, probably wiped out any sense of metaphysics in Chinese society. Although that would be in spite of beliefs such as like feng shui, that dictates the way the environment is supposed to be laid out through elements and whatnot. And a good way to illustrate this for people in the West who don't really understand what I'm talking about is that, for example, when we were having dinner with one of the salespeople in China, so what he said is that they would just go pray to their folk gods for wealth and health. Then they would pray to Buddha for happiness. And then they would pray to Lao Tzu, so Confucius, for like the education of their children. Now, obviously, this was probably some kind of self-derogatory joke made by the sales guy, but it still feels true in some sense, and that is something I kind of picked up on when we were speaking to different business people, as well as during our visit to one of the temples. Although this doesn't seem to have impacted the Chinese government's like maintenance of these temples, they look great. They look beautiful, not a chip in sight, nothing, no rust whatsoever. However, it does seem to me that the purpose of such a policy is more so to promote a kind of national sense of belonging rather than promote any kind of faith, and as well as just increasing tourist revenue. Now, a very interesting part of Chinese society that I noticed was actually the role of women. Funnily enough, while I expected China to be very patriarchal, for women to just be, well, especially in business conversations, I expected the women to just be left aside and probably be in the corner just like listening. But actually, this was not the case at all. Women in China speak more English than the men do. And they very much take a forward role when it comes to, at least when it comes to business, but even in the everyday life in general, they seem to definitely take more of a leading position than in the West or in any other society I've seen. And another interesting thing, which was definitely a contrast compared to Western society, is how direct Chinese women are. If they like you, they like you, which is very different to the Western experience of, oh, you like a girl, and even though the girl liked you, if you like her now, well, she certainly doesn't like you anymore. But anyways, enough on the cultural criticisms and analysis. Here's the more interesting part, the political economic. So one thing that my dad and I noticed when we were there is the anxieties of the businesses. The Chinese economy is not doing well for sure. So there's many reasons why, but I'm not going to go into all of them because we're not China Uncensored. This is not the point of the channel. It's not the point of the video. But the reasons most relevant to this video are the demographic crisis, the bad economic recovery giving way to a low consumption within the Chinese economy, general unease with geopolitical tensions and tariffs because of Trump's administration in the US right now, and the real estate crash. So this has led to a situation now where the Chinese businesses feel the anxieties of their economy starting to slow down and dwindle down a bit, especially when it comes to, well, the low consumption, because if no one is consuming any products, how are you supposed to run the economy? And the tariffs, since the Americans can't import their products anymore, as well as their increased labor costs after like decades of the Chinese economy growing and growing. Now, what have the Chinese companies done to try to mitigate this problem? So something we noticed is that instead of going to new markets, emerging markets like in Africa or in India, or the Middle East, is that instead they just go into this death spiral of trying to compete on price. So instead of saying we have the best product, we are the first at this market, so you can trust us the best, in making their brand better, stuff like that. Instead, they just expand their production line, which is the part of their business with the lowest labor cost. They just expand it indefinitely to try and lower the prices of their product. But the problem is they're all doing that. So now no one's making any profit anymore, and they're just chipping at each other's profits little by little. I'll get to why that's relevant in a second though. And so another interesting point on China's economy is apparently their government is changing focuses on how their economy should function. So instead of an export-led manufacturing economy, they're kind of going inside and rather restructuring it into a consumption and innovation driven economy, which is definitely aided by their high number of very high quality STEM schools, especially in such a high population country as China. And this also means that China's main exports might no longer be their mass produced manufactured goods, but rather their technologies. And this was confirmed to me when I was sitting down at some interesting tables, and I was privy to some interesting conversations with some wealthy and very smart Chinese businessmen. But obviously, I'm not getting into any names, and I'm gatekeeping that shit. Now, this isn't something that I experienced during my travels, but it's still interesting to note that China is also looking to increase its soft power through cultural projection.
问题说到摆脱性价比的标签，我觉得法国是大家真的可以多关注的一个对象，但是很不巧的是，它在国内反而是最被忽略的一个学习对象。大家一般说到出海，第一想到的就是美国、日本。我觉得物质层面，比如说技术层面，我们可以多向美国看齐。但是现在中国供应链或者说制造业，我们现在其实进入到了一个要升级品牌形象的时代，所以这个时候最应该学习的，其实反而是法国。其实有一句话，大家说的是一个产品它最好的一个模式是什么？就是中国制造，然后意大利设计，法国营销，美国消费。法国的品牌力大家都是有目共睹。首先那么多奢侈品就不说了，然后我觉得在现在这个出海2.0的时代，我们的思维不应该仅仅局限于去学习美国的技术啊之类的，因为我们现在中国制造已经非常强了。但是这种比较精神层面的、脱离物理层面更高一层的思维，是目前中国品牌打造的时候比较欠缺的。
Now the clip speaks for itself, and I'll get to it in just a second. But keep it in mind. Now, before I get into the practical implications of the things I just told you, it's important for me to make my own views clear. I love Europe. I love Belgium. I was born in Belgium. I was raised in Belgium. As a matter of fact, if I had to choose a retirement location, it would either be Belgium or maybe East Africa or maybe Turkey. But the way it is now in Europe, it is so difficult for young entrepreneurs or just young people in general to actually make money. The regulations, the cost of living, even the brain drain, and just the difficulty there is in just getting a loan from the bank or support from the government is so demoralizing. And so to make a kind of global comparison of the different power blocks and how it works is that in Europe, the government is just a constant speed bump nagging you about regulations and taxation when you haven't even started making profit yet. Whilst in America, the government and the banks love funding projects, even if they think they're fucking stupid, because apparently over there they love blowing bubbles. Whilst in Africa, the government is only really a problem if your company isn't international and if it's not paying generous donations to the country's benevolent leader. But in China, you can just go to the local government's office, knock on their door, and ask for funding as long as your company or business idea is good enough. Just make sure your company doesn't get too big and powerful. So here's the interesting part of the video. The way I see it is that unless you want to continue try-harding LinkedIn with puppy eyes, cold calling companies, begging for a internship or whatever. So here's what you actually do. Learn Chinese. And I'm talking about spoken Chinese. I'm not asking you to be able to read ancient Tibetan manuscripts. And turns out spoken Chinese is actually pretty easy. Then after that, you contact their companies, preferably non-state ones, and you ask for an internship. Whether it be a small company or a big company, it doesn't matter. Just not state ones because they generally don't seem to like having foreigners in their own company. And so what's your leverage? Well, you're an international who also speaks Chinese, and the Chinese need internationals in order to guide them towards other markets outside of China, whether that be in Europe, Africa, India, doesn't matter. And the same goes if they're not like a manufacturing company. It doesn't matter. They can be exporting technology since they're also focusing on that. They can be a tourism company trying to attract foreigners to China for tourism. The point is they need internationals. So that positions China as being a gold mine for foreigners. And I'm not just talking about Westerners. That also goes for Africans and Indians. Mind you, when we were going to China, we were positioning ourselves as South Africans, not as Europeans. So regions of the world like Sub-Saharan Africa and India are big markets for Chinese companies. But about Sub-Saharan Africa and India, why are the Chinese struggling with those places, especially when India is literally their neighbor? And us Westerners have heard through our media that Sub-Saharan Africa is accepting a lot of loans and construction projects from the Chinese government. And the key word lies in government. It's the Chinese government, their state companies going there, not their private ones. And the reason why these private companies aren't there yet is because, in their own words, they're difficult negotiators who are also taking good advantage of the Chinese price death spiral, and they really know how to poach companies who sell on price. I don't think I need to elaborate any further on the opportunities here, but I hope you understand my point, which is that China is a golden opportunity for foreigners from any background, especially if you're a young person. And the thing is, the alignments are there. They want to discover new markets. They want to export their technologies, which necessitates foreigners, since only a foreigner would understand how a certain technology can be used in their own country. And they want to export their culture. And so do you want maybe practical proof that you can actually get a job there? I am one, because I was only there for 21 days, not even a full month, and I was given 5 job opportunities. I don't even speak Chinese, and I don't even have my fucking bachelor's yet. Also with added remarks about how they can get me a Chinese girlfriend, but that's another story. Although admittedly, with my dad, I had my foot in the door, but it's not like the door was particularly heavy either, which is to say that their standards didn't really seem that high. But anyway, I'll be closing the video the same way I started it, which is with a disclaimer. I'm not advocating for even more European brain drain and uprooting. And I'm certainly not advocating for China to accept like a gazillion immigrants into their country because they need to open their businesses to new markets. Hell, I don't even really believe in the idea of like a Chinese century. But I certainly do believe that they're going to continue shaping the world economy, which has historically been true with the Silk Road, for example. And while China isn't going to be the end-all be-all future for the world, it might as well be a great stepping stone in yours. But anyway, that's gonna be it for me. Most of the videos on this channel aren't going to be like this, not about travel vlogging or anything, since I'm not some kind of world traveling business guru, but subscribe anyway. You might like the coming content. Anyways, that's all. God bless you, and I'll see you guys later.